Welcome, everyone. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be starting here in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to go over a few things. I'd like to introduce myself and our colleagues here. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm joined here today by Michael Thielander, who is our Director of Product Marketing. Also joining us is Wes Dobry, who is our Principal Solutions Engineer. So at this time, I wanted to let you know we are recording the webinar. We will be taking questions towards the end of the session, but please feel free to enter them into the Q&A at any time. After the recording is done, we will be sending you a follow-up email with links to it, as well as a link to the slides. Without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Michael and Wes. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Wes, good to see you again on another Eclypsium webinar. I'm going to jump right in. This is a really interesting topic, and we really have some new research and some new insight that we want to share with you. But before we talk about it, I want to talk about everybody's sort of favorite place. I think everybody has a favorite place. And, you know, Wes is on the East Coast over in the Florida region, but I've always been in the West and in the Northwest, sort of in the mountain states. So I tend to like mountains quite a bit. The Pacific Northwest and in Central Oregon in particular, this is one of my favorite spots. White's Canyon Preserve is right in Central Oregon, right next to the Cascade Range, has a nice little town next to it called Sisters, Oregon. But the thing about growing up in the West and living in the West and kind of enjoying this precarious balance between being in the mountains and being in the forest is, of course, that we're used to this. We're used to this sort of recurring cycle of catastrophic forest fires. In fact, right now, it is kind of, it's not funny, but it's predictable in that a month ago or 6 weeks ago, thinking about naming this webinar and thinking about the time that it's going to show up, it was really easy for me to say, yeah, there's definitely going to be some big fires happening around that time. So we can talk about financial services, we can talk about firmware, we can talk about forest fires that are happening. And sure enough, right now, the McKinney fire is burning in Northern California. It's not close to me, it's several hundred miles away, but it's an area that I grew up in around Wairika, California, where I spent a lot of time with grandparents. So we're painfully, keenly aware of this balance between really this very, very dry environment that we live in half the time, half of the year it's very dry, especially in the mountainous part. And also this sort of unpredictability of weather and nature. And I'm using that as a metaphor today, and hopefully it works and it sticks with us, because I do think that really in firmware, in the distribution of firmware, and where firmware is embedded invisibly in so many devices and so many parts of our infrastructure, and between the highly motivated adversaries, they're really looking for any opportunity to get particularly to financial services organizations. We've sort of like boxed in or sandwiched in the average CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer of some of our large financial organizations. They have this legacy infrastructure of firmware that they sometimes are not very familiar with or don't know a great deal about in terms of its makeup, its provenance, where it comes from. And then, of course, we have these highly motivated adversaries. That's our topic today. That's what Wes and I are going to share with you. We're going to talk about a report that came from Vance and Bourne. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about just the news, basically. What are the recent attacks that we've seen against network devices, against servers, against endpoints that are firmware based? I want to get Wes's take about, sort of the on the ground experience from people. And then we're going to dive into the report in some detail. As I said, we worked with Vance and Bourne to build this report. It's not quite ready for final publication, but I did just this morning send off the final proof version. But we're going to share a preview of some of the data even before it goes to any press or analysts. And then I want to talk about how we got to this situation, because the report will reveal a dichotomy, this sort of difference between the way the world is and the way that our adversaries are looking at firmware and the way that professionals are looking at defending it. I want to talk about kind of how we got to this state. And in that time, Wes is going to do a demo for us. He's going to give us some examples of what it looks like to really take the principles that we talk about around firmware security and apply that to a real world example. And then we're going to talk about how we can get the report out to you. As we dive into this and get into some of the details, I want to start off with a data point from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the US, CISA, right? Who has for a long time been helping us catalog and track vulnerabilities. this webinar and what we do at Eclypsium is not fundamentally about vulnerability management, but it's very similar in tracking and managing and mitigating vulnerabilities for applications than it is for firmware, because it's all one form of code or another. And in fact, they just recently went back, and because there are more vulnerabilities than any one person or one team or one organization can keep track of, they went and started publishing the KEV list, the known exploited vulnerabilities list. So if you're a practitioner, if you're a Wes out in the world trying to actually like get things done and shore up your defenses and build a resilient program for cybersecurity, the known exploited vulnerabilities list can say, okay, of all your vulnerabilities, and you have millions, these are the ones that are actually being attacked in the wild. And we took and we parsed that data back to 2002, so for the last 20 years, and broke it into the types or classes, categories of where that information or what actual code within the infrastructure was under attack in that KEV instance. Obviously, started off with web browsers being a big point of attack, and went into virtualization as we sort of steered the corner around the early 2010s. But then, of course, software libraries came into attack. And in fact, if you want to go back to a previous webinar that I did with Wes, where we talked about supply chain security specifically, and we talked about a federal government report that came from the Department of Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security that attributed the attacks in firmware security to two weak points. One was software libraries and the use of open source libraries, and the other was firmware. And if we continue to look at building this graph out over time, we see that obviously we get into office applications, but when we hit firmware, we start building these stack graphs using firmware, something really interesting changes. Firmware first appeared as far as the known exploited vulnerabilities back in 2005, but around 2018 and 19, it became the priority. It became a majority attack surface, really the leading attack vector used by whether it's nation state attackers or even just criminal games or even just sort of random hobbyist hackers and attackers. So we've seen this constant increase in the use of firmware as far as in the most exploited vulnerabilities. And you can see that as you stack up the numbers across the chart. And that's sort of a theoretical look at what are the known exploited vulnerabilities. But what we see when we start turning our attention to the real world is we see where the actual attacks are happening. And we see very recently a lot of new reports coming out. This one was from Ars Technica. Dan Gooden at Ars Technica did an article on UEFI firmware and a UEFI rootkit. UEFI is obviously Universal Extensible Firmware Interface. I almost stumbled on that. And that gives us a standard format for how we can build out firmware that embeds into the hardware that we use. And a particular rootkit that was discovered and is starting to appear in the wild. And his point in this particular article was one that we'll keep coming back to again and again in this webinar. These attacks are invisible to most of the defenders that are out in the world. As far as endpoints go, we also saw significant attacks and a lot of exploits specifically on the Intel, compromising Intel ME vulnerabilities or Intel Management Engine, which is another chip embedded piece of infrastructure or code that comes out of the manufacturing plant that tells the systems how to operate and how to work. We saw a leaked string of emails from Conti, the Conti game that talks specifically about how to compromise that. We have a blog article on that whole process if you go back and look at it. And then, of course, with the release of sort of the opening of hostilities in the Ukraine and Russian war, we saw a lot of specific attacks on endpoints using wipers based in firmware to be sort of the initial foray to start damaging the enemy's infrastructure as the Russian aggression really started invading into Ukraine. So that's endpoints, but we also see it in network devices. In fact, sometimes we see it even more in network devices. We had an alert from CISA last year on Cisco vulnerabilities that were almost entirely all in embedded firmware that comes with the device. We obviously see that with Pulse Secure and other devices. We had just about I think now about 2 or 3 months ago, a whole string of vulnerabilities came out surrounding F5 big IP devices, which are used in many large organizations' infrastructure to publish out their applications and services online. And the interesting thing about the F5 vulnerabilities was the only mitigation listed for all of the top vulnerabilities for F5 was update your firmware in that system. Obviously, most of those systems don't rely on sort of traditional applications and code. They rely on firmware. Of course, updating the firmware has been for a lot of internal infrastructure teams and CIO teams has been sort of anathema. It's a difficult thing to do, potentially fraught with risk. And then of course we saw in Fortinet as well a number of new attacks last year on that type of infrastructure. So if we've seen that on endpoints and we've seen that on network devices, it's not at all surprising that we've also seen it at the server side too. On the server side, it's a different focus of firmware-based attacks, typically around the baseboard management controller interfaces or BMC interfaces. And there's some of these vulnerabilities, like the pants down vulnerability, which has been around for quite some time, years and years, that really seems to keep popping up in some vulnerable servers. In this particular article, and this is just from May, we highlighted, or it was highlighted by Ars Technica, that Quanta servers, a major server manufacturer, had sort of a reoccurrence of critical pants down vulnerabilities through the BMC that could lead to compromises. And of course, we did our own research recently, back in spring of this year, that talked about vulnerable BMCs in HPE servers. So wherever you look across our attack surface, our infrastructure, whether that's again endpoints or network devices or servers, we see these attacks increasing. Before I get to the report and what the world says, I want to turn to Wes real quick and say, Wes, as a practitioner who spends a lot of time out in the field helping our customers do POCs and initial implementations and answering their questions, from your perspective as a practitioner in the world, why do we see this increase in firmware-focused attacks across all three of these key pieces of infrastructure?
It's a very interesting perspective when we take a look at firmware attacks as a whole. As you mentioned, we're seeing a tremendous rise in it, and the reason why is ultimately its opportunity. We're seeing these attacker groups look at the technologies that come out on both the network deep packet inspection perspective, on the endpoints, on the EDR, XDR side of things, and when they start to look at both, how do we get into an organization, how do we stay persistent, and how do we actually grow our presence within there, going OS and other areas is less critical because it's harder for them to actually get access in those situations or be caught or have the visibility. Organizations still don't necessarily take a perspective of looking at firmware and finding firmware attacks. Well, what this means is that for these nation state attacker groups and these advanced these more advanced groups, is that when they do firmware related attacks, they end up with longer persistence in an organization. They can continue to remain within that organization without being detected for extended periods of times, years and longer in some situations. And by doing so, this means that they don't have to worry about all these other tools and all these other things detecting them because they can just remain within there. So this is really ultimately the crux of the issue, is that for them, it's easier to find it because it hasn't been a focus, and it's easier for them to stay within the organizations.
I think that's a great read on it, and it brings to mind, at least for me, this notion that we sometimes fail to see our adversaries, whether it's a financially motivated criminal gang or whether it's a nation state, as being a sophisticated organization looking at things like ROI in the same way that you and I need to look at ROI in terms of what our daily investments are and what we invest energy and money into. So they're looking for attack vectors to go, yep, I need something that can get me through the current defenses. I need something that's persistent, and I need something that gives me the greatest possible leverage, whether that's in, as far up the stack as I can get, or whether that's the maximum amount of destructive capability I can have. And all of those, that's basically firmware. And I think that as a sort of a ROI motivated organization, they're going to look at what it costs to invest in those kind of attacks and what it costs to engineer them, and they realize that that's a really good payoff, especially because they're very difficult to defend. So that's a great take. Wes and I are going to now dive into the Vance and Bourne report, and we're going to see how that view of the world maps to what cybersecurity decision makers view of the world. And so a little bit of background on this report. Vance and Bourne obviously has been they're a leader in surveys and research, and they've been doing this for, I think, 30 years now. They've been doing this kind of research. And we asked them to look specifically at financial services organizations, but to look at it globally. Some of these problems and challenges really have a global scale to them. So we asked them to look at really the people that make decisions relative to budget. So we're talking to chief information security officers and chief information officers, the heads of vulnerability management, the heads of endpoint security, people in charge of infrastructure security. And we're looking at them around the entire world. We started looking in May, right after we had actually done another webinar, and there were a lot of the articles that I pointed to previously had already appeared in around the March, April timeframe. So awareness was a little bit higher, we thought. And we wanted to get a total of 350 IT decision makers in financial services and organizations that were 1,000 employees or more. So they're a little bit higher place. They're potentially in the global 2,000 in terms of overall size. We wanted to do it across the whole world. So we did 200 of these in North America, and then we did 50 in Singapore, 50 in Australia, New Zealand area, and then 50 in Malaysia. And again, all the respondents were from the financial services sector. So what did we unpack and what did we run into? I'm going to walk through the data. At any time during this, go ahead and fire off a question. We'll probably collect them at the end and shoot through any questions that we have, or as we get into Wes's demo, fire off a question there as well. So I think some of this might be, it'll make perfect sense to you and you'll say, yeah, that's the way that I would see it. And some of it might be something of a surprise. One of the questions we asked was whether their organization had ever been the victim of a firmware level attack. Sometimes they simply don't know. So they had an opportunity to effectively opt out of this question. But if they knew, they were able to say, nope, it's never happened at all, or it's happened, but it was more than 2 years ago, before we changed current processes. Or they could say, yes, we have been attacked at a firmware level. Yes, it's happened more than once or at least twice, or more than twice. And this number was a little bit staggering to us. And when this report gets publicized in, I think about the 14th or 15th of this month, this is probably what the headline is going to read, is that 88% of organizations, financial services organizations that we interviewed worldwide, had been victim of a firmware level attack. And over 50% of those had been a victim of that level of attack more than twice. Compared to the amount of focus and people whose job it is to look at firmware and infrastructure security, it's a pretty telling number. There's clearly an imbalance there between those two forces. So that leads us to the question of is there an awareness gap? So do the IT security decision makers, the people that set budgets in finance, do they view a gap in their awareness? They see a firmware blind spot. And this had somewhat predictable information in it, but also a wide gap, a wide range. There were fully a number of these that said, I think there's a little bit, 16% said there might be a little bit of a gap between, where our blind spots are relative to firmware and our infrastructure. And again, we asked them to focus on, in an earlier part of the introduction, network devices, endpoints, and servers, as well as connected devices, really everything within their infrastructure. But really the vast majority of them, 58%, said they were mostly aware of what the gaps are. They recognized that there were some small gaps. Very few of them said that they were totally aware. Actually, 23%, they could not be more aware of the gaps that exist in their infrastructure. I guess it's better than not knowing that you have gaps, but then the question is like, how are you going to close those gaps? So it was an interesting way to look at what's the overall awareness. But the dependency of that awareness, in other words, why is that awareness? Why is there sort of this difference between this expectation of what firmware looks like and where their firmware defenses are, may come down to a couple very specific mistakes. 81% thought that their vulnerability management solution was capable of solving a firmware security problem. That's a really, really interesting take. And a similar number, 83%, thought that their endpoint detection response or their XDR solution, whatever they had doing endpoint detection and response, threat detection at the endpoint level, could help them solve their firmware security problems. And this is a really fundamental problem. In fact, an article came out not 2 days ago where this was reiterated. This was actually repeated, and not by me, although I do say it quite often, but by somebody in industry that said the challenge is that we have significant attacks happening that people think potentially or conceptually, this should be covered by my vulnerability management or my XDR solution, but it's just not. At the end of this webinar, we're going to point you to a couple of resources, but I just put them in here as a reminder for me. We actually have solution briefs that speak specifically to why vulnerability management is not a good tool or not a capable tool for determining what firmware vulnerabilities look like, and the same on the XDR side. Bottom line is nobody's at fault. They just were never built for it. They just weren't made to do it. It's not the kind of thing that they were purposed to do. Another question we asked is, given the understanding that we have of firmware security, we asked some questions about whether it should be managed out of the vulnerability or out of the endpoint detection space. And the majority of people said that it should be managed, I think about 70%, as its own separate tool with its own force. But we asked, do you need more money, whether you need more people resources and human resources? Nobody's ever going to say no to the question of, do you need more money? But we asked them to actually quantify it to some degree to make it a little bit more difficult. But 93% said they need an increase in investment for tooling and solutions specifically, because they started to recognize that gap. And even though they have a high confidence or expectation that vulnerability management, some of their endpoint or network detection and response tools would be able to help them with the firmware security problem, started to understand that they're going to need new tools to do it. 89% said we're basically going to need a whole new body. We're going to need a new person to kind of start owning this problem and thinking about it holistically. That's an interesting point that we'll bring up later as we talk about some of the solutions, because I think that you can either look at the problem of these firmware attacks and you can look at it from a previously segmented silo, like my job is endpoint, or my job is network security. I have NDR tools. That's what I do in my day job. I'll start taking firmware responsibility within that scope. Or a way to look at it and say, no, my scope is really protecting firmware across the infrastructure, and I have to work with my server team and my endpoint team and my network device team and my IoT team as well. This was a really telling question where we basically asked, who do you think is better? The real question was, do you think that adversaries, from what you've seen, from the attacks you've experienced based on your own lived experience, adversaries are better than you are better at attacking firmware than you are at defending it? It's very rare to see something sway this high in any kind of a survey, but 92% believe that the adversaries are better at compromising firmware than they were at defending it. And it raised some interesting dialogue and some questions where after this survey came out, we started seeing some stuff just in like this Reddit example. Hey, is it that easy to download firmware rootkit off the internet? And the answer is yes. While the rest of the world, while I think the defenders of the world catching up with infrastructure, starting to leverage, containerization and cloud infrastructures, have been kind of looking at ways to scale out, to actually scale our deployment of applications. Our adversaries have been looking at ways to sort of undermine those. And that includes being able to buy things like firmware rootkits just off the dark web. And then it explains to some degree the resurgence of some of these rootkits that really existed, we knew about 3 or 4 years ago, coming out of nation state or government adversary attacks, now being used in the wild by commercially motivated attacks as well. So one of the things is that adversaries are better at defending it because they know where to find the tools. They know where to find the attack sources. A point that really, frankly, disturbed me, over the last 2 years, I've been personally deeply embedded in firmware security and understanding what the ramifications of it are, understanding the who cares about it, was that we asked them to identify where firmware is in their infrastructure. This could come down to a survey failure or a failure of the survey instrument. But I think that we were pretty clear saying, pick all that apply, pick all of the things of this list of things in your infrastructure that actually have firmware in them and firmware that needs to be defended. Well, they identified the things really at the top of the list, obviously security controls, again, like Fortinet tools and devices, and like the F5, well, they're not really security controls per se, but F5 embedded devices that rely on firmware, or network devices like Cisco. But really 0% of our very educated, capable, in the field respondents to the survey correctly identified that all of these device types come into service with vulnerable, exploitable firmware. And that comes to a scale question. How big is the problem really The problem is very big when you step back and look at firmware is everywhere. We'll touch on that again. There was another series of questions in the survey instrument that asked about threat detection. Threat detection has really become, it's really matured over the last couple of years and become our primary lever for understanding, once we've deployed our infrastructure, what's under attack, and what can we do about detecting those attacks in progress, and where are we within the kill chain. So what was the percent that believed that modeling exercises must include firmware level threats? It was very high, as you would expect. I would expect nobody to say, oh no, we're not going to anymore after the news that we've seen over the last 6 months. Yeah, we're not going to worry about firmware. So obviously a very high percentage said that our threat modeling exercises should also include firmware level threats. The challenge is, how do we get there? When we looked at whether that was threat modeling exercises as a whole, the relevancy to today's threat landscape, modeling out attacks at device level, we asked them to pick whether they needed significant improvement or a small improvement or notable improvement. And the numbers were pretty staggering. Those that said we need significant or notable improvement was in most cases well over 70% or over 80% in some cases, or well over 70% into the 80% range. And that's, I think, a really good indication that threat modeling is our way forward. It's a way to understand the lay of the land and what's actually happening in our active environments, but it's not equipped right now really to work with threats. So our last webinar actually was about firmware and indicators of compromise at the firmware level. Encourage you to go back and look at that one. You can find that, I think, in YouTube, or get an on-demand version of it by clicking through our site. But that's a key problem, I think, going forward, is we have to start including this understanding of firmware within our threat modeling as well. So I'm about ready to let Wes launch into a demo. Before we do that, I want to sum up our view of the world. 3 reasons why these firmware-based threats are so pervasive and so potent right now. And also, what are the things that we can do about it? Because it's not all gloom and doom. Actually, there's a lot of good solutions and tools that are now starting to focus on the firmware problem within a supply chain. But why the supply chain, firmware-focused attacks on supply chains are increasing, and 3 things that if you're defending a digital supply chain, what you can do about it. Reason that it's increasing, number one thing to remember and to carry forward as you have conversations with your C-level executives, managers, and your teams, firmware is everywhere. It is literally everywhere in the supply chain. You cannot get away from it. A report came out from Gartner actually about 1.5 years ago now. And if you send me an email, our email links are at the end of this, I will send you the specific name of this Gartner report, but it came from an analyst named Tony Harvey that covers endpoint servers and infrastructure, great analyst, and pointed out that 15 to 20 firmware components are shipped with every single endpoint that goes out. We're used to thinking, oh, firmware, you mean like BIOS or like UEFI, that component. Well, really, there's a lot. It's more than the 1 or more than the 2. There's dozens of firmware components in every endpoint. If you step up to servers, the number ratchets up even higher, because of course servers have multiple things to control. They're dealing with baseboard management controllers and IPMI controllers, and dealing with some capabilities within it that are specific to the server's job. So in servers, we see 30 or more firmware components in every server that we deploy, whether physical or virtual. And then of course, network devices. There is no, I had to pause for a second and see if this was hyperbole, but I don't think it is. I don't think there is an endpoint or a network device or connected device that ships anymore without some form of embedded firmware on it. Now, not all of it gives highest level of privileges and the highest level of persistence and power, but literally everything, whether it's Fortinet devices, VPNs that we use so pervasively now, whether it's network attached storage, all of these come shipped with firmware. So the number one reason that this problem is pervasive is we don't understand really how much firmware attack surface is out there. Number 2 reason is that when it comes to the intelligence of our infrastructure, firmware is the DNA of the entire supply chain. It is firmware that carries the instructions to all of the individual components of when to connect, who to connect with what privileges to connect, with what permissions to connect, whether that's at the CPU level or whether that's at, again, baseboard management controllers, something as simple as and pervasive as, say, USB controllers or memory being controlled within chips. And every one of those now is subject to its own individual attacks. And all of these attacks are looking to leverage and compromise the fact that firmware is the DNA of the supply chain that tells the downstream components when, how, and where to act and what to do. The footprint and power is very pervasive and amazing in that. And the critical thing is that as much attack surface as there is, and as much power as they're in and going right to, trying to compromise the DNA and reshape it itself, our existing tools, the tools we most rely on, vulnerability management and endpoint security, again, not to knock on them, they were never built really to do that level of reconnaissance and that level of remediation, really far below where the operating system is. And to some degree, you can find endpoint tools today that say, hey, we give you a firmware check now, but it's really just looking at what is the operating system, what can it tell us about, say, UEFI or BIOS firmware. Third reason is that organizationally, so if the first reason is firmware is everywhere, the second reason is that it's a high caliber target because of its importance, because it provides the instruction set for all of the supply chain components. The third reason is that organizationally, it's a bit of a hot potato. You have a lot of parts departments under the CISO's umbrella, under the CIO's umbrella, whether it's vulnerability management or network security or the device manufacturer, that all now are involved to some degree or another in the firmware game, but through no fault of theirs, they've not really been trained up on firmware. They don't understand what is distinct and different about firmware. They've tended to live in the OS and the operate application world. And there's just this sort of hot potato mentality of trying to figure out whose job is it really to manage this firmware. A lot of people point upstream and say, well, that's the device manufacturer's responsibility. But anymore, we can't really use that, because if a device manufacturer like HPE, in the case of ILO bleed, or say the F5 devices that required an update, says we must update that firmware, but that's not carried out downstream, then it becomes a problem, I think, effectively for everybody. But it is organizationally a hot potato in that regard. So we're going to jump into a demo. In the demo, there's three things I want to point out. I want to point out really our philosophy of the three things that you need to do to get ahead of this problem. First is you need to identify firmware wherever it is in your supply chain. A lot of talk since the presidential executive order last February about creating an SBOM, where we believe all SBOMs, software bill of materials, should have an FBOM component, the firmware bill of materials component. We should be able to discover devices and be able to list and inventory their firmware, and not at a casual or surface level, but all the way down to the specific components within an organization, and be able to search across those too. So if I happen to get a report of a specific, say, I pick Lenovo just because they're showing on the screen here, but say a Lenovo vulnerability, where can I go to specifically find that? Or if I'm looking for specific vulnerabilities in network interface controllers that are being exploited, where does that particular firmware exist within my infrastructure? And our vulnerability and risk solutions don't do this. Again, they're just not built to do this. Also, the second thing that you need to do is you need to verify that firmware. So we build the inventory, we build a catalog of the firmware that's in your environment in every device. Now we have to verify it against a known good sample of that firmware, just like we do with secure configuration management and other practices in cybersecurity. We need to assure the integrity and assure that it hasn't actually been tampered with. That's a little bit harder said than done, just because there's not a lot of available tools to really get into that level and unpack that firmware and do a binary level analysis of it. Typically, we're relying again on reports from the operating system. And in this case, I think we need to dig deeper and kind of get our hands on it ourselves. And that's a little bit of what Wes is going to show in our demo. And again, endpoint security solutions were not really built to do this. The third point is once you've identified your firmware and verified its appropriate state is obviously to fortify it. By fortify it, we basically mean update, patch, secure, reconfigure that firmware if necessary, if it's deviated from its known good configuration status. So when you find a firmware component, can you actually initiate an update? Can you drive an update? Do you have an application or a system in place that helps you do the updates like the F5 updates that we mentioned earlier? Or can you leverage, if you have another system that's got its own workflows, its own process in place to do some of that update, can you leverage that system to provide the update information for you? So that's the three things that we identified, the three big problems that are sort of exacerbating this overall firmware security problem. The three things we need to do is identify, verify, and fortify that firmware. I want to get into now a demo of putting all of this together. And I'm going to turn it over to Wes. And I want to ask a specific question. You know, you might be asking yourself, okay, I understand the threat landscape. I understand the news. Where do I stand? You know, what firmware do I have in my environment? And of the firmware that I can find and identify, are there components that are being actively exploited? Let's look at how Eclypsium helps you do that. And I will stop sharing and turn it over to you for a second, Wes.
Perfect. And so, as Mike was saying during the hot potato section, around when we look at devices as a whole, how do we identify what's within an environment, if it's something that even needs to be patched, if it's something that you're even aware that it's down level? And that is a challenge as practitioners within every environment. We all have our solutions that give us an asset inventory, but is it of the level of detail of what you truly need to make sure your environment is at a low risk and actually isn't actively being exploited? So when Eclypsium looks at this, we break it apart really into a few different sections. As you see here, we have our devices section, which I like to classify as the asset inventory or the identify that Michael was talking about. We have our risks section, which is really about compliance controls, as well as vulnerabilities and risk within the organization. What vulnerabilities are available, what devices are outdated, and what is probably the lowest hanging fruit in the environment for an attacker. And then, of course, we have our integrity side of things, which I like to equate to threats within the organization. So that is actually exploited vulnerabilities that we have, known indicators of attack or indicators of compromise that we can see, things that we have validated and identified, as well as things that you may not know about and that existing tools can't tell you, like integrity failures. Is that firmware what you expect it to be? Has it been tampered with? And is it what actually came from the manufacturer? As well as things like baselining. Is that device configured the way that you would expect it to be from a firmware perspective? And is it a risk or threat to your environment? So diving in first, I wanted to look at a little bit of the firmware asset inventory side of things. So I'm just going to pick a device here. And as we look at this device, this is just a HP Elite book. It's actually our CEO's device. And as we look at this device, it's running Windows 10. And when we take a look at devices, we don't just look at things like the UEFI and BIOS. As practitioners, we've always looked at things and tend to have lumped firmware as a whole into the BIOS of the system. Nowadays, though, as you can see here, you have things like the TPM, all of your PCI devices running option ROM. You have microcode on the processors. You have entire management engines, even on our endpoint devices and our enterprise. All of these components we need to track from both a vulnerability, a change management, and a regular baseline configuration perspective to make sure they're as secure as possible. So as an example of that, if I come back over here to my risks and we take a look and I just search here by CVSS, you can see that we have high risk vulnerabilities discovered in this environment. But if I pick on one that Michael was speaking about earlier, like pants down, the way that Eclypsium looks at this is we want to provide organizations the most detail about these specific vulnerabilities. So in this case, we show a lot of information about what that vulnerability is, what the recommendation of it is, and probably my favorite part is we always provide external reference documentation so that you don't have to take our word on why something's bad. And then, of course, equating this back to the devices itself. But when we look at threats as a whole inside of an organization, one of the largest things is what we classify as a firmware implant. And if I look at implants here and I pick one of these devices like this HP ILO, for instance, and we look down, we of course identify that it's out of date. And then in this case, we also show that we have detected ILO bleed on this device. So what that means is that we have pulled a full firmware image from the ILO off of this HP server, And we've identified that because of a version mismatch of what it's reporting versus what we see on the firmware itself, that there's actually a threat on that device. And likely this device needs to be taken immediately out of service because it has actually been became a malicious device on your network. Same thing happens when we look at other styles of devices, like endpoint devices. For instance, if I come in here and we just search for desktop here, I can pick any of these endpoint desktops, and you'll see this is a Latitude 5480. And we can see that this device now has a little bit of red on it. That's indicating that there's actually something really bad on this device. In this case, we actually see that this device has a backdoor embedded in the UEFI firmware itself, and more interestingly, has other unknown things on this device. This means that it's stuff that was on this device that did not come from the manufacturer. So in the case of your threat hunting teams and your patch management teams and such, you can actually dive as deep as you want with the Eclypsium platform to identify what is out in the environment, how it looks from a firmware perspective, what our scans look like, and even go all the way down into the actual binaries itself and reverse engineer them too, so that you can see why we indicated that it was a threat or something to be concerned about. So in summary, when we look at firmware as a whole inside the organization, it's really about showing you what you have. So identifying every piece of firmware inside of your organization from all devices. So that's endpoints, servers, and network devices and IoT devices inside your organization. Identifying any known risks. So that's vulnerabilities, compliance controls that require attention, as well as fortifying your environment by identification of any threats, anything that you may not know about, and if anything doesn't match with what you expect it to be. All of this is then looped in so that we can send automated alerting out. So sending it to your SIM or your SOAR so that things can actually happen from this data. You can get systems patched, you can get systems taken offline that are actually malicious, and overall just make your entire environment much more secure.
Thanks, Wes. So I think that's a great demonstration of what we mean when we say identify, verify, and fortify. But we were looking at your screen there, Wes, and we showed, a couple hundred servers, which 30 or so servers, a couple hundred endpoints, a bunch of network devices. What does it take to actually do that and get that kind of work? Walk me through like what we implement, what we actually put in place to give you that information and that reach into the firmware.
Yep, absolutely. So Eclypsium takes a standpoint of simple approach for how to get this data out of your environment and get it processed. It all starts with a single cloud instance where we host it for your organization. We don't share data between organizations. That instance is fed with our intelligence feeds. So that's things like our firmware integrity database, our YAR rules for threat inspection and other ways of investigating additional threats and vulnerabilities, and ultimately just feeding this with real-time data. Your devices would then have agents or scanners installed on them, depending upon what the usability of that is, that sends us data encrypted, where we then process all that data on the back end. We can also use those endpoints, those agents or scanners, to do discovery of the local network. So you'll see here that we can do unauthenticated, which is typical network discovery protocols, where we find things local to that device on the network. If we then find a device that we do know about and we want to do deeper scans, we can do authenticated scans where we'll use vendor APIs, SSH, remote consoles to actually do full firmware image pulls off that device. And we do that in a way so that we can actually do firmware integrity checking on devices like Cisco switches and routers, for instance, so that you can discover if it's been tampered in the supply chain or before it's hit the floor. On top of all of this is getting an interface so that you can use it. I showed a little bit of our web console today, but you can also access every bit of data out of our system via API. We have customers that use us in a completely headless fashion, where every bit of access is from API so that they have a single pane of glass. I did talk a little bit about web alerts via webhooks or syslog into other systems like SIMs and SOARs, where you can automate actions when we determine something. So when we find new devices that are just put on the floor that have outdated pieces of firmware, we can go ahead and notify you so you can take action against them. And of course, wrapping all of that in a framework that allows it to be secure and allow authentication to our solution in your standard frameworks.
Thanks, Wes. That's a great breakdown. So ultimately, this is what we need to do. And I would encourage everybody to think about this problem, of what we need to do with firmware and our infrastructure to secure it. That means identify, verify, and fortify it. And of course, think about how do I deploy a solution that can do this everywhere, which is, I think, one of the things that's very appealing to me about the Eclypsium solution. It's designed to work with your network devices, also with our depth of breadth and expertise in servers, as well as endpoints, and looking at this, securing firmware and microcode across your infrastructure as an enterprise-wide problem. And looking for a source that has all of that information. We support about 22,000 endpoint and server models. And I noticed on Wes's dashboard, if you see it again in the lower right-hand corner, it shows how many basically library samples, how many binary profiles that we have in our database. And it ratcheted up. It was 6 million something, and now it's 7 million something. So constantly adding new profiles to our database so you can ask that critical question, whether it's an endpoint or whether it's an HPE server or whether it's a network device, is this the right firmware? Does it have the right stuff on it? And I think ultimately this comes down to, I'll go back and answer a question from earlier, who cares, right? Who's the person that cares about this? Whether, obviously, if you're a CISO or CIO, concerned with how do you help your company, pursue digital transformation and grow while also sort of securing that backdoor, you have a very unique and understandable perspective. But you might be in charge of endpoint security. You might be a network security guy. You might be a vulnerability person. You might be a security solution architect that's looking at, like, what are the things that I'm going to need to employ, the new technologies that I'm going to need to get my hands on to make us resilient and defendable in a rapidly changing world. So regardless of your perspective, I think there's an application here. So what are you going to get? A couple of things for you to take away with, and then I will ask Melissa to dial in any of the questions if we got any questions over the course of this. I'm not looking at the right screen right now, but basically, based on the email that you signed up for this webinar, you'll get a copy of this report. It might have a slightly different title because we're still, or cover on the front because we're still working on the graphics of it, but you'll get this around the 14th, 15th of October directly into your inbox. So look for it in your spam mail. Hopefully it won't get in there, but everybody that's on this will get a direct link to it. And then when you receive it, if you want to share it within your organization, you can share the report, or you can point them to a landing page that we'll create. And of course, I cherry picked some information from it to share with you over the course of this webinar today, but there's a whole wealth of interesting information about what the world thinks about their current security, state of their security around firmware, and kind of where the world's going to go to. I also mentioned earlier 2 solution briefs you could go to. One on sort of the 5 reasons why vulnerability management wasn't really built to solve this problem, and why EDR wasn't built to solve this problem. If you, what's the best way to do this? You'll actually get a follow-up email from Melissa after this, and it will have the PDF of these slides in it. Embedded in that PDF, I have links back, actually they go back to those different documents. So you can do download some of those artifacts and get some research out of it. I'm going to turn over to Melissa and see if we have any questions. We're right on time, but maybe we can take 5 minutes to do some questions.
You bet. So here's the first question that came in. It is, what's required to install your product so it does only network device scanning? Are there network segment constraints?
Yep. So good question there. So as far as doing just network device inspection, that's actually easier than doing, all the endpoint and other things, where all you need is one initial scanner installed. That scanner just looks on its local network segment, but in large enterprises, as you can imagine, you have a large address space that you may need to scan. So you can either do that with one scanner continually scanning, or you could have multiple scanners divided into multiple network segments for reduced visibility sake.
Thank you, Wes. The next question that came in was, do you integrate with HashiVolt or other secret stores?
Yep. So when we're doing those authenticated scans, we want to do credentialing or do the authentication of them in a way that's done securely. So we can certainly integrate with things like HashiCorp's Vault or TACAX or things like that, so that we can securely get the credentials to then do authenticated scan on those devices.
Great. The next one is, can you share the CISA or CISA data on KEV segmentation?
Oh, let me take that one. Actually, that CISA data on that particular chart that I showed is actually in a blog post that we have. If you go to our website and just go to blog, you'll see a list of recent blogs. It'll be on that very front page, but if you just click into it right there, you can download we actually did a separate graph year over year of all of those individual vectors, all those classifications of attacks and exploits, and then a summary of it as well. So that's a good place to get that reference.
Great. Another question that just came in: how are companies dealing with mixed on-prem and cloud environment using our tools?
Yep. So the cool part is that our tool basically runs in the cloud anyway from an organizational perspective. So all that they would need to do is just install our agents or scanners in those specific instances. So in cases of servers running in the cloud, embed our agent in your image, and then it will do periodic scans when that device reboots or is re-provisioned. For on-prem, same concept, just putting our agent or our scanner out there. It's rather non-intrusive. It effectively scans when the device boots. So in those instances, you would deploy it in the same way, whether you're running in a cloud environment or on-prem.
And I just want to add, I applaud whoever asked that question, because it's really tempting to say, hey, for the stuff that's in a cloud environment, that's somebody else's hardware, and the integration between those applications and the firmware that's on those systems is effectively their responsibility. But if you do look at cloud responsibility matrices, it's easy to say that, but ultimately to defend that workload and understand if you're going to move one of your workloads, one of your applications onto a system that has, for instance, out of date firmware, you have not updated the integrated lights out, that ILO functionality within HPE, or the cloud provider has not done it. I think you have a right, even a responsibility as a user of that cloud platform, to say, I don't want that workload on there. That workload is too critical to me. I don't want to take that risk. We need to either update that or move it somewhere else. So I think that question is exactly the right mentality or outlook to have.
Great. And just following up on that, what does a POC consist of, and how long does it take?
Yep. So we can usually do proof of concepts in a matter of a couple weeks in most cases. What those are is that we have a conversation with you about what your environment looks like, and based upon that, we come to mutual success criteria, and ultimately we would spin up a cloud instance for you, provide you access, and then at your leisure, you deploy the agents out there and see the data that's collected. We'll help you read through it and make sure that it's completely understandable. And then once you've been happy with the data or unhappy, we take feedback and wrap up the POC at that point. But in most situations, we collect the data on the POC within a matter of minutes after you getting the agent installed, and go from there.
Thank you, Wes. At this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I'll give it one more second to make sure. But
Well,
I
will
want to
just
thank
say,
you both for joining us.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for joining us today. We're hitting the road again after a year and a half of not doing a whole lot of events. We've done a couple recently. I recently did an event in Singapore that was great to talk to the Asia Pac crowd that really we haven't been able to meet with face to face for over a year. But this month we're headed to Black Hat next week. There's our booth, and actually if you click into this link on your PDF, you'll actually go right to the booth map, if you will, and you can see where we're at. We're right over in this section, and then right after that we have two of our best researchers, Mickey Shkatov and Jesse Michael, are doing a presentation at DEF CON High Stakes Update. So if you're going to Black Hat or you're going to DEF CON this year, please drop by and see us. And then I just want to thank Wes for taking the time to put together the demo, and Melissa for coordinating everything. Thanks very much, guys, for helping us with this call today.
Thank you so much. And again, we will be following up with the links to the recording and the slides. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.